Today we have the opportunity to listen in as a book read group from 14 of the Ivy Tech campuses across the state engage in a discussion on several chapters of the book Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. This is a book that was written several years ago by an individual who was a self-described hillbilly with roots in eastern Kentucky. Most of his adolescent years were spent near Middletown, Ohio. Rebecca Keene from our Richmond campus utilized this book as the basis for an adjunct faculty training in the past fall. She and Dr. Russ Baker, Vice President for Academic Affairs, decided to use it as the subject for a book group they put together in the spring semester. The group of faculty and staff from all over the state first met on April 12th to discuss the first 5 chapters of the book. The session you are hearing was recorded live on April 26th, and they will meet once again on June 14th to conclude the book read. What you're going to hear was unrehearsed and unscripted. Some of those within the group don't particularly like the book, while others are more positive. So you will hear a range of opinions and perspectives. But I think you will find it intriguing to hear this group discuss a book that focuses on students not unlike those we often work with here at Ivy Tech. In putting together the members for our book club, we reached out to each campus and invited them to name one participant. We were pleased that most of our campuses decided to participate. In the discussion you are about to hear, our participants include Russ Baker, Vice President for Academic Affairs, Systems Office, Tara Bauman, Nursing Faculty, Tara Hote, Thomas Doherty, Program Chair for Agriculture, Marion, Crystal England, Administrative Assistant for Nursing, Richmond, Kevin Foster, Assistant Professor of Mathematics, Bloomington, Catherine Waltz-Friel, Dean of Arts and Science and Education, South Bend, Rebecca Keene, Program Chair, Medical Assistant, Richmond, Betty Klein, Program Chair, Healthcare Specialist in Richmond, Julie Van Laer, Adjunct Faculty of Philosophy in Madison, Aaron Miller, Full-Time Faculty of Humanities, Columbus, Cody Mullins, Associate Professor of English, Kokomo, Leanne Reckton, Program Chair of English and Communication, Lawrenceburg, Candy Schladenhoffen, Associate Professor of Anatomy and Physiology, Fort Wayne, Suzanne Skinner, Full-Time Faculty of Human Services, Anderson, Alicia Spray, Dean of Arts and Science and Education, Lafayette, Barbara Wiley, Program Chair, Education, Indianapolis, Robert York, Dean of Arts and Science and Education, Sellersburg. There were 3 members unable to join us for our live discussion. They were Betty Klein from Richmond, Kevin Foster from Bloomington, and Candy Schladenhoffen from Fort Wayne. Please be aware that this book deals with some sensitive subjects and frequent explicit language. These topics are included in our discussion. Enjoy this lively discussion.
I just want to pick up on something you were talking about before about the male-female roles. When it comes to, just to bring it back to our students, a lot of our students, minority or otherwise, come from strong family traditions where they need you back on the farm to work, or they need you to go out into the labor force and work. And having your own dreams and defying that is a huge challenge. And how do you do that? So I think of a lot of our own students are facing some of the same challenges of how can I be what I need to be and challenge the authority of a paternal or a maternal figure.
Cody, as you've gotten into this book much more deeply than the rest of us with your dissertation topic, wondering if as you've studied specifically the language, and going back to Julie's point about perspective across the decades that one might have, in an instance like what we've last been talking about, how much of that, and not just here but throughout the book, have you sort of dug into and unveiled for yourself is narrative in the moment and recalling those particular interpretations he would have, takeaways he would have?
That's an excellent point. And it's one I think that Leanne brought up is in terms of language in our last meeting, because this is the thing. There's a TED Talk out there that he gives, and I'm not sure if it's right before or right after this book comes out. And if you watch that, it is like this is going to be a terrible exactly reference, but it's like reading the Jeffersonian Bible. It's like all the miracles are cut out. It's just the philosophy of it, right? And it's palatable because he's telling his personal story and sort of how he came to go. And it almost seems like, and again, I've not talked to JD Vance, so I wouldn't actually know this, but it seems to me like a lot of the personal narrative is him trying to reconcile and grasp with this thing that happened to him in a really, harrowing way that is interesting. And then it almost feels like an editor or a publisher came back and was like, we need to sell this book. This is an important book and we need to sell it. Please tinge it with these things, because so I mentioned there are a lot of hillbilly stereotypes here. On 105, right? The song, guess what song is playing when his papaw dies? It's always got to be Skinnerd, right? You can't have a book about hillbillies without Skinnerd, right? When in fact, it's really funny, the teenagers and the 20-year-olds in Eastern Kentucky are listening to rap and they're drinking Crown Royal. They're not listening to Skinnerd, and I'm serious. Go there. Just it's true. And so I just wonder. It really makes me that point to what is memoir, what is remembered, and then what is culturally added because it's in the everyone's going to connect to it. That's a great question, and that's honestly what I hope to to really discover here, because I really want to like this guy and I really want to like this book. And I know that sounds completely opposite to what's been happening in the last 2 sessions. But and so I have adopted this narrative where I think that he is kind of pushed to include these things because it will appeal to a wider audience of middle class to upper middle class white people, basically, who think about this region and think about working class people in general in a way. And so he's sort of saying, but see, it's kind of like a subtle, this is how it is, and I recognize that, and you all know that's how it is, and I got out of it, so maybe let's invest. That's kind of what I think's happening, but I think that's a really good point, because there's a couple times when he he mentions his Southern accent. Just pull up any video, listen to him talk. If that's a Southern accent, then I've never been to the South, right? I think it's all sort of for play. It's all for, I don't know. I really wish that it hadn't happened, because this book would be much more enjoyable for me, at least. So.
Well, we all construct narratives and stories about ourselves, and whether that's for a smaller or bigger audience, and I think that as a survivor, which he is a survivor, that's a difficult story to tell. And I think that in some ways it might be more comfortable to tell a story where you've pulled yourself up by bootstraps rather than you've been successful because of maybe dumb luck and government assistance.
That's a good point.
In chapter 8, we're coming to, Grandpa's died. Lindsay is married. Mom's still been in the same relationship for more than 5 seconds.
A new record.
So it sounds like, Mom's getting ready to move him out of something that he's more comfortable in. And she's basically saying, you have to go with me. You're not staying with Mama anymore. And he is kind of, obviously, he's not wanting to leave his comfort. And with that, they end up at therapy. So he didn't even know his mother had a therapist, and that kind of surprised him. So it struck me that his first mindset when he was first approached about therapy with Mom was he was very excited. He seemed like this was a great thing. He thought this was going to build a common space for him and his mother to grow upon. And he was very much looking forward to it. Well, then what ends up happening is he gets into the therapist session, and he feels like she had already foreseen this way of him, and he was blindsided by that. So since he had this first negative interaction with the therapist on the very first coming, then the therapist becomes an obstacle to him. And so it's just something else he has to overcome. And the thing I would like to point out here is so many of our students, faculty, staff, I think therapy sometimes is seen as, a negative. It's not always seen as a positive thing, and asking for help can really be a hard road. So this young kid is finally going to the therapist, but I know as an adult myself to go to, say I'm going to a therapist, that might look in a certain way. So how can we, as faculty and staff, help our students and each other be more acceptant of going to therapy and asking for the help that we need?
Well, I would say it's not just therapy, but going to disability student services, going to tutors, that it's not a sign of weakness. And sometimes, and hopefully this doesn't happen too often, that if the first person they go to doesn't help them, that they just stop. And that's an important lesson. That's part of that perseverance. That's part of that determination to find the right person to work with you. But often it's just easier to give up after the first try. So yeah, we do need to find ways to make sure that everyone is top notch. But at the same time, that if from the student's perception, it's not working for them, that they don't stop out.
I think a lot of the issue with his situation with the therapist in the book was that she didn't have a relationship built with him. She had a relationship built with the mom, but there was no relationship built with him. So he felt, as he describes, that he was coming in and had to defend himself right away. And I think something that we see with our students is a lack of relationship building. And I know on our campus specifically, we had a number that students could call to get some assistance. And the number was publicized all over campus. We put it in our bathroom stalls, and students could take the slip of paper. And we're paying $3,000 a year for this service that maybe 3 students utilized. And we had a conversation recently about how do we remedy this? What can we do? And I suggested we start by building a relationship with our local community and get somebody in at least maybe, I don't know, an hour a week, perhaps, to have that relationship be formed. Because I don't know about you all, but I don't like talking on the phone either. And I don't think our students like talking on the phone. I think they prefer to text or email. And so maybe there's another option within that platform. But I really believe that it starts with building those relationships. And that starts with our advisors. That starts with our faculty. That is everybody that has any kind of face-to-face interaction with our students, especially. I think we can build from there. But I do want to say one caveat to that is we have to be careful that our faculty members, especially, and our advisors, don't try to become their therapist, because there is definitely some separation and issues that could arise when that might start to happen.
To kind of back up what she was talking about is I've told you that I have lots of students with lots of problems. And this semester I have at least 3 students that I have recommended getting counseling because they really, really need it. And by knowing my community, I'm a social worker, so that helps because I know a lot of therapists within the community. And there's some places I just won't send them to because I know they're going to get maybe the bare minimum of whatever. But I try to send them to people who really are willing to work with young people and usually professionals in an area that particular student needs. And we're developing this other IV
assist.
Assist, thank you. And, I'm sure that's going to be helpful, but I want to be very careful where I send them also, because this happens more often than we know if you go to the wrong therapist.
I teach public speaking, and I have a special section for students who are highly apprehensive. And I have usually lower enrollment in this particular section. And I had a student this semester getting ready to give a speech on his emotional support dog. And I said, well, are you going to bring him with you? And he was like, I can. I said, yes, I would expect that you would bring him with you. So he brought him to class that one time and then has brought him back ever since. And he's now our mascot really for our class. But I watched the environment completely change in the room once he felt comfortable enough to bring Riley with him, that's his dog, and then the other students to help encourage and support that. And so then we build this community where we're fostering not only that individual student, but then everyone benefits from that as well. So I really like that point of of therapy animals or other alternative things that we might be able to do to help our students.
On page 126 and 127, he does raise what was, again, a 90s era debate on school vouchers, and essentially comes down to that discussion about public institutions, and he cites the one teacher who attributes the problems to the parents. They want us to be shepherds to these kids, but no one wants to talk about the fact that many of them are raised by wolves, the teacher is quoted as saying. So I thought certainly, and since I think I have the next chapter, I know I have the next chapter, that's a fair lead into the chapter 9 content that is far more social than narrative in what he presents. But just in terms of that, I was hoping we wouldn't leave this chapter before we somewhat address that, since we work for a publicly funded institution ourselves, not a K through 12, but obviously it does point, this is a topic where a lot of fingers get pointed at the public institutions. Certainly there is a narrative trajectory in chapter 9 that runs very quickly. I'm just going to, in bullet points, this goes from the point in which he's living with stepfather Ken, about to leave, and then moving back in, what we'll say permanently, with Mama in this point of his life. And that, there's this conflict that he begins to notice in Mama about the trips to Jackson. They're starting to cut down a lot. And so that piece that he really finds root in is starting to be diminished from her lack of will or want to go to Kentucky. And then the last couple of big narrative movements in this chapter involve, first of all, his advancement in school, and where he's beginning to see education itself as, really the springboard toward the future, as well as his observations that begin at the grocery store. And it's really there that the middle part of what I'm cueing us to discuss rests. I'll start with the quote where Vance writes on page 138 and 9, "Working as a cashier turned me into an amateur sociologist." He begins to observe. He begins to observe the customers. He notices the trends, how what he perceives to be the more well-to-do people purchase, how the people who are coming in using food stamps purchase. He sees misprioritization within that kind of spending. And it also then grows into where the chapter, I'd say of all the chapters, this is the chapter where we begin to see a lot of first-person plural employed to talk about the community. It is also the chapter where the phrase "our elegy" is used, and we begin to then see that thematic, it really takes off. And so I really, you can reference specific pieces here in the book, but I want us to bounce off some of what you see bullet pointed across the latter half of this first side and the top half of the second side of my sheet. Because here we begin to get a little history lesson. We get a lot of depictions, historically, and I think Aaron, from probably one who teaches this era as well, we see that this part of the country is moving from one political faith, as he portrays it, to another through a series of social events, from civil rights through social conservatism, through the sentiments that begin to emerge among even the working poor, that there are a lot of people that are taking advantage of the system, as he's identified and as he hears Mama often chant. And then it gets close to home as he begins to look closely at the most immediate surrounding neighbors, and begins to then portray this sort of tapestry of people who surround him, where we see the police cruisers, we hear the screams, we begin to see sort of that social decay in the immediacy as he's observing. So it arrives upon this series of points where he begins recognizing people are we're spending ourselves into the poorhouse. Our homes are a chaotic mess. We don't study as children. All this first-person plural appropriation of the place, but I think it's also transcending Appalachia at this point, and he's discussing this in light of his views of the working poor, no matter where the working poor live. So that's where I'd really like to open up the discussion. And Cody is grabbing for the mic.
So a couple things, and your I guess recap here. One of the books that he mentioned is Charles Murray's Losing Ground. Does anyone know anything about Charles Murray? No?
I do a little bit.
Yeah. So Charles Murray is sort of famous for studying the African American community specifically, and kind of, among other things, highlighting or at least arguing in his point of view that African Americans are sort of genetically predisposed to, I guess, poor living conditions because they have lower IQs and because they don't create anything meaningful in Western society. These are things in his books. And so this is important. Like the reading, if you read between the lines in this chapter, the things that he is, I guess, that are forming his political belief system are a little alarming. But that's the one thing. So if you notice, he kind of conflates this, and his argument in a sense is that, you know, Scots-Irish people of an Appalachian area are sort of genetically predisposed to making poor decisions as well. But I think that, so that's kind of where he's coming from a theoretical standpoint. The one other thing that I thought is kind of really interesting, he's so bitter and embittered by people, I guess, his perceived people of taking advantage of the welfare state, system. And as Suzanne mentioned last time, who is a professional in this field, which J.D. Vance is not, again, like, what is this, like 1% to 2% of the population that this actually applies to? So it's a lot of sort of armchair judgment that he doesn't understand anything about these people. Like, he's just seeing them at a grocery store and making statements about them because it supports sort of this bootstrap ideology, right? It's definitely poor people using food stamps to buy T-bone steaks instead of, like, the sort of hegemonic large billionaires and trillionaires in our country. That's definitely their fault. Definitely the poor people, right? And that's kind of what is a little alarming about this chapter to me, I would say.
I would say the one comment, and it's kind of telling, the books he's reading, we don't know if they've been recommended, he's found them, and that can always be a problem when there isn't direction. An educator, someone who's informed, so he may be falling into traps the way often we do. We pick up a book and we think that's the gospel truth, especially if you haven't had the prep work to understand how to read it. So I'm not taking responsibility away from him, but I think it's understandable. He's trying to find some guide, and so these are the books he latches onto. And I think, again, we're saying he's trying to separate himself, or that he's already feeling the separation. So now he's starting to see things that have always been around him. Plus, let's face it, he's at that perfect age. Everything else is wrong, everyone else is wrong, and I need to find, I'm uniquely right in what I'm doing. So I think he's trying to find his way through. It doesn't take responsibility away for it, but I think that it is one of these things that when people, and perhaps sometimes our students read books that they haven't been prepared for, then those ideas take over, and then the question becomes, how can we take the value of anything in those books, or at least the thought process that the students engaged with, and put it in a positive direction?
Let me introduce a more sinister idea for what's actually happening here. I don't think that young J.D. Vance picked up Charles Murray and read it. What 14-year-old would do that? I do, however, know that J.D. Vance is on a panel with Charles Murray in 2017 to kind of discuss the plight of the working class. And so it almost seems to me as if, like, this is definitely something that he's picked up along the way. And yeah, I mean, a memoir, you have these creative, you can create creative dissonance where you can impart and input things where it might not fit actually realistically, but where it fits nicely narratively, I suppose. He's talking about the things he noticed in this part of his life, so it would make sense that he would talk about that theory there, I guess, is what I want to say about that.
I also think that sometimes people in general find things to observe that fit the script of what they've been taught. So this whole time, his grandparents have been talking about how people live off the welfare system and about these perverts. And so I think he is picking out things that fit that script. If you look on page 139, he sells it pretty well about halfway down the page, where he says, I also learned how people game the welfare system. They buy 24 packs of soda with food stamps and then sell them at a discount for cash. They'd ring up their orders separately, buying food with food stamps, beer and wine and cigarettes with cash. They regularly go through the checkout line speaking on their cell phones. I could never understand why our lives felt like a struggle while those living off of government largesse enjoyed trinkets that I only dreamed about. I think he's trying to fit the script that he's been taught, that people who are on welfare always game the system, and that his life was undoubtedly harder because there were others, quote, taking advantage, when we know that that probably isn't true. Are there people who game the system? Probably, but is it the majority of the people? I don't think so. I think he's doing this to fit his script and to justify his feelings here.
I'm glad you mentioned that bit about black, quote, folks, as if there aren't black people who live in Appalachia. There are black hillbillies, everyone. They're there. Like, it's hillbilly is not a white term. Like, I mean, I know that that's how he uses it here, but this book is so devoid of race in a very bizarre way, except when you're trying to compare, basically, you know, except when it's convenient to be like, oh, like this book's about black people. So that gives you a frame of reference of like, we know, you know, readership, the royal we here, we know like the struggles of the African American community. Well, it's the same here, but like, sometimes it's one in the same community, and I think that's really that gets glossed over a lot. This year is the 25th anniversary of the Afro-Latin movement, which is a group of poets from Appalachia who are also African American, and so they identify. You know, it's a different culture, sort of from this, certainly. And I just want to note that if you didn't know there are black people in Appalachia, there certainly are.
So, Robert, what do we do with this paragraph on 147? It starts out, we don't study as children and we don't make our kids study when we're parents. Our kids perform poorly in school. It goes on and then says, even the best and brightest will likely go to college close to home if they survive the war zone in their own home. I don't care if you got into Notre Dame, we say, you can get a fine, cheap education at the community college.
When I read that line, it resonates probably in each one of our campuses' geographical areas where we realize that we are somewhat immediately in competition, to use air quotes, with the four-year neighbors. And oftentimes our institution in our community's minds is somewhat formed by what, you know, some of our students' families or our potential students or our high school students' families have instilled in them about the college. And we become, at times, for some, depicted as the cheap education. I don't mean we believe that. I know our students come to us and know that's not true. But there's obviously everywhere a lasting portrayal of community colleges as lesser than the Notre Dame or the four-year regional institution that's close to us. And as we've worked very hard as an institution to, over a long period of time, to not just validate, but truly we put in the work to develop curriculum, to develop content to attract students, to, through dual credit, attract students who realize if we're working with their teachers on that curriculum, that there's an assurance that that is of equal par with everything. And I would love to get to the day where the perception of community college in families hits the equal plane with the perception of premier institutions or four-year universities.
Did I miss the note? Did we not just agree with a partnership with the University of Virginia? Did we do that?
Yes, we did.
That was what I thought.
Well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Russ, because there was earlier when he mentions like sort of redactively like, Mom, she had kids. She didn't even go to college. Well, she eventually went to community college, and I just like cringe, you know.
I know we often hear just general studies major, just a community college, and obviously he's got a little footnote to the chapter, to the paragraph you selected, Russ, that we learn about later about how in reality there are probably greater opportunities than people imagine at Notre Dame and other premier institutions. But by the token of perception, again, I think he doesn't work in this paragraph to fight off that perception. He seems to somewhat reinforce it.
I think the next statement says volumes 2. The irony is that for poor people like us, an education at Notre Dame is both cheaper and finer. So he's talking about probably, aid, right? Because community college aid is based on cost of attendance. And so the lower the cost of attendance, the less aid that you get, correct? And so, I think it's interesting that he makes a point to say that in this text. I don't agree with that.
Russ and I had the opportunity at the beginning of this week to go to the Ivy Honors graduation dinner, and the guest speaker was phenomenal, and I've only was able to record part of the presentation, but the short version of it was, he's a community college student, but he came out of Georgia, and basically the story he was telling was of himself and his 3 friends. One incredibly brilliant, but ended up in a life of crime and ended up in prison. Another one, despair that he could never get out of the system, committed suicide or died in a similar fashion. And the third one just ended up being he was smart, but he just dropped out and said, I'm just going to go make money. And despite his brilliance at mathematics, which was with cars that he was talking about, that he's now working in a factory pushing the same button 10,000 times a day to stamp metal parts out. And that, he didn't want that. He saw these things around him and that he was trying to overcome. He saw the community college because he came to Ivy Tech, Indianapolis. He started there. He went on. He's now clerking for an Indiana State Supreme Court. Most eloquent guy I have heard at one of these presentations for a long time, and that's not a knock against the other speakers. It's how good this guy was. So talking about, much like Vance, I see something, I want something more. How can I avoid the trap?
I've just been thinking about the fact that a lot of what we're talking about with language has to do with what you were talking about earlier with identity and how we see ourselves as the other, but then at the same time we see ourselves as part of, the group. And I think a critique of this book is a challenge to us individually, and that he continuously will, question everything that happened to him and everything else in society and maybe not recognize his perceptions or take that responsibility or that ownership. And I think we probably have the same things, as we're critiquing him doing that. Are we not doing that ourselves? Are we not doing that with our students in our classrooms? When I see students who complain about not having time to do X, Y, Z, but then they're on their phones all the time, or I see that they're on social media, that creates a perception that is probably not accurate. And I think sometimes I think what I'm getting at is that the critiques that we offer about this book, I think are sometimes critiques that we should also recognize that happen within ourselves. And I'm curious about, we've not really talked about ethics yet, because I think it came up in this chapter and the chapter before about him giving his mom the urine sample. And we're talking about the language here with how he said his mom was entitled when she asked for the urine sample. But how do our students feel about plagiarism, and where is that line, and how do we help educate them? That's where I took that example of the urine sample from. How do we help them realize that getting your mom to proof your work is probably just as unethical as this example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, to follow that, Leanne, that when we get down to presentation of who our students are, and that throughout all the chapters that we've discussed this morning, we've made reference to counseling services and a whole host of other support systems, which, certainly we've built over years, to the end of maybe portraying ourselves as a college as somewhat of a social service itself. And that's why in my earlier statement in reference to that paragraph about studying and what kind of college to aim for, that we often as an institution really promote ourselves for those particular kinds of services. And so it, in effect, draws and markets toward a certain demographic that then perhaps detracts a different demographic at the same time. Not that that's our hoped for outcome, but by virtue of, again, back to that familial installation of what are these places, what is that college, certainly there's the potential there for attraction and detraction through how we've sort of identified ourselves. I've never heard a student speaker at any event as the highlighted speaker whose story was very middle of the road, coming up through K through 12 with stability, parents. Every commencement speech I've ever heard has had somewhat of a dramatic Vancian flavor to it. So it's one thing that we may as a college consider as not a point counterpoint as much as where might we complement both sides of that presentation and anticipate the external perceptions.
I think that's a very good point. I had not thought of that. That's very, very interesting.
We need to love the students we have, not the students we wish we had or that we wish we have. And I guess when I'm reading this book, one place I don't totally agree with Cody on all of his perspective on this book. I probably give J.D. Vance a little more benefit of the doubt, but Cody has done a lot more research on this than I have. I grant that. But one thing that does bother me, and again, it gets back to the quote about Notre Dame. We know that we're not at the same level of academic prestige that Notre Dame has. That's not our mission. I have no problem at all sitting in the same room with somebody who is from Notre Dame and feeling every bit as worthy to be there, because frankly, I feel the mission we have is more powerful than theirs is. No disrespect to Notre Dame. I would say the same thing with Purdue or other state universities that sometimes I think try to make us feel like we're lower on the totem pole, but we're doing something that, they can't do, or at least if they tried to do it, they wouldn't do it as well. But this idea that, the students who can make it are better off going to Notre Dame than they would be the community college in Ohio near where he grew up, I'm not ready to accept that yet. Because for one thing, the people at Notre Dame might not, I don't think they would feel a sense of community or the sense of faculty reaching out and staff reaching out to them like I know happens all the time at Ivy Tech. Yeah, Notre Dame has a 90-some% retention rate and graduation rate, but part of that is because they handpick and select just a very small percentage of students to come. We would have a retention rate more like that too if we were as selective as they are, I imagine. But that's not our mission. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned this idea of our students do bring a lot of the characteristics we see in this book with them. That's why I think Rebecca and I wanted to read it. But we still, these are the students we want to serve. We want to see them succeed, but we want to serve them. That's not meant to be a closing statement.
Well, I've seen a lot of studies that actually suggest that state schools and community colleges, there's a lot more learning that goes on there because at the larger, institutions, the Princeton, Harvards, and Yales, TAs primarily teach the courses. There's a lot of gentlemen's C's handed out. And so there's actually more learning. And then the research that's coming out of state schools and community colleges actually, because we're at the periphery, we can have crazy ideas and try crazy things. And those are actually the ideas that take hold more than the powerful core institutions.
I also think that we meet a lot of students where they are, and they would not have gone to a four-year college. So many of my students would say, oh, I knew I'd never make it there, because they wouldn't get the support that we give them. They wouldn't have that access to the faculty. I mean, I remember when I was in college, I got nothing. I was lucky to see an advisor once, ever. Yeah, I think that because we care and because we know these students need us to care, they respond to that, and they do much, much better than they would if they'd ever tried going to a four-year college, because they need that support. Even if they're coming from a really high educational level and they feel good about themselves, and maybe they want to save money, because I do have some that do that. The parents are going to pay privately, and mom and dad says, well, if you can get part of it here, let's do this and save some money. But even they need that support. So I think we provide a wonderful service, and especially for people who come from the low-income areas, because many times they come from families like this that don't feel like college is important, or they don't think that knowledge is important, and they aren't real supportive of the kids going on. Anderson was a factory town. We're not anymore. So there's not any backup to what they can do. So getting that 2-year degree and selling that to our young people in our community, and even our older adults who have lost those jobs, is really important. So, I'm with you. I see us as a very important role in our students' lives.
The thing I love about community college, and this is the second one I've worked for, is that we're the ones out in the community, by which I mean the rural settings. We make education more available, even if they have to do it online. Every place is probably within a half hour, maybe 45-minute drive, and that's not going to be true of the big boys. I respect what they do. They're fantastic. They're great research institutions. We're about the education. So I'll leave it there, and I promise that was not a commercial.
And, well, to continue the commercial, and Vance actually has a great opportunity here to sort of support community colleges, because he doesn't go to Ohio State right away because he's not ready. He goes to the Marines, which is a stabilizing force. In a lot of ways, community college and a lot of our students, either, emotionally, financially, whatever the reason is, they're not prepared to go and succeed there. I mean, didn't Purdue just put a study out that showed that our students on average do better than an entering freshman, because we have that stability in there. And in a lot of ways, especially if you're a student like this who's lacking some sort of familial or structure, we provide that in big ways.
Thank you for joining this special episode of Our College, Your Voices. I want to again thank all the members of our Book Read Club who have participated so effectively and with so much enthusiasm. We're looking forward to having one more meeting with this group in June. I'm the guest host for this episode, Russ Baker. You can connect with me on rbaker80 at ivytech.edu. Our producer is Ann Penny Valentine. Ann is on Twitter at IndyPenny. You can reach us by email at ourcollegeyourvoices@ivytech.edu. Leave us a voicemail at 317-572-5049. Our website, www.ivytech.edu/podcast, is maintained by Tracy Allen. Production assistance is provided by Becky Campbell, Sarah DeWitt, and the Ivy Tech Community College marketing team. The podcast concept is by Matthew Pittman. Theme music, recording, and post-production services provided by Jen Eads at the Brassy Broadcasting Company. We'll see you next time on Our College, Your Voices.